One thing that we've talked about a lot on the channel is all of the different types of loan delinquencies that are happening right now and how they're all spiking. I've put up charts with this before to show you guys just how bad this is. But recently, we had some of the big banks pull back the curtain and exposing just how bad some of these recent defaults and delinquencies are. And these banks are taking major losses because of it, okay? Right now, you have JP Morgan Chase as well as Wells Fargo claiming $3.5 billion in losses because of this massive surge in delinquencies and bad debt that these banks are holding on to right now. And that's $3.5 billion that's not going to get paid back, guys. That's how bad this is. That's money that these banks will just not be able to collect, and they'll probably send some of it to collections to try and get collected. But essentially, they're selling off that debt at pennies on the dollar to a collections agency who may be able to get nothing as well. Just for JP Morgan Chase alone, they say that their net charge-offs, which are the delinquent debts that they do not expect to receive, hit $2.2 billion in the second quarter of 2024. And the year's only halfway over. If everybody's prediction comes true that we're going to hit a recession after the election is over, you can guarantee that these losses are going to continue to mount. And it's funny because I believe it was Chase who recently announced that there's going to be no more free checking accounts with them. And a lot of banks haven't had free checking accounts for a long time, guys, because even the ones that pretend like they do, at least the big banks anyways, they say they're giving you free checking. But in reality, they make you have a minimum balance, $1,500, $3,000, whatever it is. So it's not free because you have that money that's tied up in those banks that you can't take out without getting charged a fee. So that's the issue with those free checking accounts. Like if you truly want a free checking account, I can give you one suggestion, one company that I like. I like Discover Bank, okay? And this is not a commercial for them. It's not sponsored by them, but I've used them for a long time, and they will give you a truly free checking account. I'm sure there's other online banks that do this as well, but you can have $1 in the account. You can have $5,000 in the account. They won't charge you a penny. And on top of that, they'll give you free checks, which is something else the big banks won't do. The only downside, no physical locations. But if you can deal with that, then who cares? Plus, their customer service has been amazing, guys. Like you call them and literally you talk to a person in the United States within 30 seconds of that phone ringing. I'm not even kidding. That's how good it is. Versus, all these robots that they try to stick you with at the other banks, and you got to go through this whole spider web of prompts on pressing 1 and pressing 7 and this and that just to try to talk to somebody, 10 minutes later. So I highly suggest looking into something like that if you truly want a free checking account. But anyways, these delinquencies are continuing to go up in the wrong direction, okay? Because this $2.2 billion of losses for JP Morgan this year so far, that's a $200 million increase from the previous quarter and an $800 million increase from just a year ago in quarter 2 of 2023, guys. That's almost an extra $1 billion in 1 year that its customers can't pay back. Is that a sign of a strong economy? That's the question I want everybody to ask themselves when you hear stories like this. Because on the one hand, you hear stories of some people doing better than ever. On the other hand, you hear stories like this where these charge-off debts are increasing by $1 billion year over year for just one bank. And this is all meanwhile inflation is supposedly coming down, right? So this is supposed to make things easier for consumers, which also exposes how much of a lie that is too. Because inflation coming down doesn't really help anyone because all the damage has already been done and the prices are already high. And they're not going lower, they're just going up slower. And at the same time, these delinquencies are going up and the bad debts are going up. We see no slowdown whatsoever in the amount of consumer debt, especially credit card debt, continue to skyrocket. And it seems like it's just gonna keep going up forever, guys. Like literally the credit card debt looks like the stock market right now. And check this out, in addition to the $2.2 billion in losses, JP Morgan also declared an additional $500 million in losses from failing mortgage investments. So this is starting to become a problem too. People not able to pay for their house anymore. But I wouldn't be feeling too bad for banks like JP Morgan, because in the end, guys, they still earned $13.1 billion of profit in the second quarter. Even with all of these losses, technically, they can afford these losses, but since it's a publicly traded company and their mission is to provide value increases to their shareholders, this isn't good news for them. But even with this level of losses, the JP Morgan share prices are still sitting at around all-time highs. And I think this also highlights another issue with our economy today, in that people are just not afraid anymore. Everybody is just YOLO investing to the moon right now in hopes that this whole thing is going to go on forever, which we've seen in previous bubbles throughout history. You know, this is how people behave when things are this crazy. You know, they feel like if it's this crazy, then maybe it'll just continue being this crazy. Let's take the chance. Let's keep investing, right? And the point of this story wasn't to get anybody to feel bad for JP Morgan or any of these banks that are taking big losses on the chin right now. It's just to expose how big these losses are. Like, for example, their quarterly losses were $2.2 billion and their profit was $13.1 billion. That loss is about 15% of their profit. That's a significant amount. And if those losses continue to increase, then their profits will continue to shrink, which means a contraction, which means the economy is not doing so good. Here's something else one of my viewers sent me, because I asked in a previous video here, like, if you're getting credit card rates that are high right now, send me over some of the credit card interest rates you guys are facing. And I forgot who sent this to me, but I'll put up a screenshot here. I remember they said that they have good credit, and these are the credit cards that are being offered to them when applying for a new credit card, okay? Look at the interest rates for these credit cards. The first one here, anywhere between 20 to 29.99, okay? The second one has a 35.99% interest rate, and also the one at the bottom goes up to 29.9%. And this person has good credit, and these are the type of credit cards that are being offered to them. Now, in reality, people that have good credit, I would say most of them probably don't even have credit card balances and are not really going to be subject to paying these interest rates anyways. Like, I would accept a credit card that's giving you 50% interest rate. You know why? Because I don't care what the interest rate is, because I'm not going to pay it, because I'm not going to carry a balance and have to pay interest on that balance, you know? So if I found a card that was offering, you know, the best perks ever, but it had a really high interest rate, I would still take the card, because I know I'm not going to end up paying for that interest like a lot of people will. Now, another thing that we've talked about here a lot on the channel is all of the home loan programs to get people into houses with little to no money down. United Wholesale Mortgage recently announced a program with this. I covered this a month or two ago here on the channel. And one of my viewers, Paul, sent me this email of another lender in his area that's offering 0% down home loans now. Check out this email, guys. 100% financing. Qualified borrowers can purchase a home with no money down. Our 100% financing option with fixed rate term is available on primary residences for loan amounts up to $766,000. So this lender, on top of giving you a 0% down mortgage, they will also cover your PMI payments for you. Check this out. Well-qualified borrowers will benefit from 100% financing without the need to pay for private mortgage insurance, because Northwest pays the PMI on the borrower's behalf, keeping your monthly mortgage payment lower. Once again, another sneaky tactic to get people into homes at all-time high prices and try to lower your payment as much as possible for two reasons. Number one, makes it more appealing and more attractive for the home buyer to enter into that contract, but also the other thing it does is it helps more people qualify, because the more they can lower the payment, the more people they can actually qualify for these loans. So if they weren't doing this, a lot of people that normally would qualify probably wouldn't. Here's another option they have for you. You can do 3% down, and none of it has to be your money. You can get a gift from mom and dad and go ahead and get into the house that way. So it's just one thing after the other with all these lenders, guys. They're just doing everything and anything they can to continue to get people into these homes. But the interesting thing is that it's not working. because if it was, then we would see the pending home sales and the closed home sales surging right now, since it's still the home selling season. But in fact, what we're seeing is the opposite happen. You know, I covered this last week, how 2024 has so far been the worst year in history in terms of closed sales. You know, 2023 was already the worst year in history, and now 2024 is on schedule to be the even worse year in history. So even with all these tactics out there, it's not enough to get people in through the door. And I think it's because a lot of people are still looking at this and saying, hey, you know what? My budget has gotten blown so far out of proportion because of inflation. I'm not going to be out there looking to buy a house at these prices and have that payment, even though these guys are giving me some sort of a deal, because the deal is still not good enough to justify paying these prices and having a $3,000 a month mortgage payment. Now, DJ sent me this story out of Miami about affordable housing, because there was a brand new building that opened up in Miami, or actually in Palmetto Bay, back in March of 2024. There's 120 units at this building, brand new, right? And its sole purpose was specifically to give older Floridians access to affordable housing. So it's basically an old folks' home for affordable housing, okay? That's the whole purpose of this building. Well, now just recently, people got notices that as of July 1st, their rents were already going to be going up, even though they just moved in March. So not even a half a year in this building, and they're getting notices of rent increases. Now, before you go and say, well, that's why we have rent control in California and all this stuff, okay, there's more to it than that, all right? Because even though they don't have rent control in Florida, their leases in this building are still governed by some national housing laws when it comes to the median income of the area. So these landlords are not allowed to increase the rents more than what the median income of the area went up by over the past year. So it's not they can just say, well, your rent is $1,000 a month, now we're raising it an extra $1,000 a month to $2,000. No, they can't do that. But just the way that these guys went about this is just so wrong. You know, like, people moved in on March 4th, right? And just 57 days later, on April 30th, the management team posted a flyer for all the residents to see that they have a 60-day notice of an upcoming rent hike. Wow, check out that car. You don't see one of those every day. It's old Rolls-Royce limousine. Very cool. Now, the reason that they posted this increase is because they said that the median gross income of the area went up, which justified their ability to increase the rent, according to the lease. As of April 1st of 2024, the median gross income of the area went up 6.29%. So residents on average were seeing their rents go up by about $130 a month, which doesn't sound like a huge increase, but when you're a senior citizen living on a fixed income, it can make the difference between getting by and not. Now, what the lease says is this: if the median gross income of the area increases during the lease term, the owner may at its sole discretion increase the rent to the maximum allowable amount based on the new median gross income. So it's not like the owner was out of line and with the rent increases, but the way that they went about it was pretty shady. I think we can all agree. Slapping people with an increase just a few months after they moved in is just a big slap in the face, really. Now, a lot of the senior citizens that moved into this building said that they were unaware of this rental increase provision in the lease because they were so desperate to get into a place that was cheap that they overlooked it. So it's as much their fault for signing the lease and getting into this deal without knowing what you're getting into as well. You know, you can blame the landlords all you want, but it's not like it doesn't say it in the lease. It wasn't a complete surprise that they're allowed to do this. But essentially what happened is because of the way this went down and such a bad taste it put in everyone's mouth on how fast they wanted to do the rent increase, that they said they're going to cancel the rent increase for now. So there will be no rent increase for July this year. But if they're not going to increase the rent this year, you can basically guarantee that they're going to increase it next year, and they're going to increase it probably to the most extent within the law that they're allowed to. And if the area's median gross income went up 6.2% in 1 year, and say it goes up another 5% next year, well, then these people can reasonably expect about 11.5% increase in their rent next year instead. So all this does, just like pretty much everything else that gets put on hold, is it delays the inevitable, guys. And these senior citizens are gonna be facing that big rent increase sooner or later. And it's really no surprise when you hear stories like this that evictions throughout the country, but specifically in the Sun Belt, are surging. A lot of these areas are starting to see evictions now go past pre-pandemic levels. According to Eviction Lab, in about 6 cities in the Sun Belt, evictions are up 35% or more compared to the pre-COVID normal. This includes places like Las Vegas, Houston, Texas, and Phoenix, Arizona, where landlords filed more than 8,000 eviction notices just in January alone. That was the most ever in a single month for the county that includes the Arizona capital, okay? And the Phoenix eviction court hearings often run for less than a minute. One judge signed off on an eviction after the tenant admitted to missing 2 rent payments. So that's how this goes. In order to keep this moving, you have this backlog of evictions that were not performed for the past few years, and now that they're finally starting to happen, they're like, boom, you didn't pay, boom, you're out. Just like that. So Eviction Lab tracks 33 cities across the country and their eviction filings, okay? And 10 out of the 33 cities are seeing eviction notices at 15% higher or more than what it was pre-COVID. So you're really starting to see these evictions ramp up. And just take a look at these charts here, guys. Like Las Vegas is crazy. Really in 2021, it started going nuts, and you can see how much things have surged past the pre-COVID average. But in Columbus, Ohio, it actually looks a lot worse because the trend is still going up. Just like in Phoenix, you're still seeing more and more evictions take place than you did pre-pandemic. Dallas, not nearly as dire of the situation, but still not looking good either. Just in these 33 cities alone, which, there's a lot more cities in that across the country, Eviction Lab tracked 422,000 eviction filings for the first 5 months of 2024, guys. That's a lot of people potentially getting kicked out onto the street. Now, not everybody that gets an eviction filed against them actually ends up getting evicted. Sometimes people come up with the money, they work something out with the landlord, and they actually don't follow through with the eviction proceeding because it does take time. It costs money for the landlord to do that, and in the meantime, they're not collecting rent. So ultimately, what the landlord wants to do is get paid their rent. They don't want to evict people. I went through this before as a landlord as well. I had to evict somebody. What ended up happening in the end is right before the court date came along, like a few days before the court date, the tenant left on his own. So I didn't actually have to evict him, okay? But we were this close to having the hearing, and he would have lost because he wasn't paying the rent. That was the reason he was getting evicted. He hadn't paid for already like 2 months. Tried working out a deal with him. He promised he was going to start paying weekly and catch up until he was all caught up, but he basically lied and he never did. He never tried to catch up. He promised that he would, but he didn't. So when that happens, it's time to follow through with what the law says you're allowed to do, and that is evict somebody. Here's a funny thing too, and this is also a warning for anybody who wants to be a landlord out there, is you better make sure you know what the eviction and landlord-tenant laws are, where you're going to be investing in real estate, because some places it's a lot harder to evict somebody than it is in other places. Like for example, in Florida, when I went through this eviction proceeding, guys, it was 30 days, okay? From the time the tenant got the 3-day notice posted on his door and was served by the sheriff, the notice to appear in court, he had about 30 days to figure out what he was going to do. So it wasn't that much time until the time he got the notice that you're going to be evicted until it's time to actually get out. And the sheriff would force them out after the eviction proceeding. But in other states, it can take months or even years, like here in California, where I would never be a landlord. I would never buy an investment property here just for that reason, okay? Because you don't want to be the one holding the bag when it comes to all these expenses. And one thing that this story talks about is that how in New York City and in Philadelphia, which is basically on par with California, the eviction filings have stayed down due in part to increased renter protections in those areas. So basically what that means is people have more ways to get away with not paying you and not get evicted in certain cities and states across the country, and you as the landlord end up having to get hit with those extra expenses. So just a quick warning for anybody that wants to invest in real estate, you better make sure you know 110% what the eviction and landlord tenant laws are where you're going to be buying real estate, because it can make or break how bad things can be for you if you end up having to go through an eviction. And of course, no big surprise, one of the main reasons that the eviction filings are up is because of the sharp increase in rents over the past few years. People are having a hard time paying for it. And like I said, you know, every landlord usually wants to work it out with the tenant. What you really want is you want to collect the rent. You don't really want to throw somebody out on the street, but it comes to a point where you don't really have a choice, you know, and that's the issue. You have to decide as a landlord, how long are you going to let this go on for and not get paid before you act? If you ask me, you know, it should be right away, because you can give people a second chance. You can give them the opportunity to start catching up on payments and paying you back. But if it was like the tenant I had and they say they're going to do it and they don't, well, then clearly you need to evict them. And the worst part is when tenants lie, okay? Because it's one thing if a tenant loses their job and they don't have the income and the ability to pay. That's different than someone just actually refusing to pay because they'd rather spend their money on booze and cigarettes or whatever else they feel like. But most tenants are smart enough to realize that they don't want to have an eviction on their record, because once they have that, it's sort of like being marked as an outcast, guys, because now once they go to apply to rent somewhere else in the future, that's going to come up on their credit report that they were evicted before. And how many landlords are going to want to accept somebody who was recently evicted? I know I sure would not. But you know, just like we talked about the other day, that you have senior citizens that are starting GoFundMes, or people are starting them for them in order to help them stay in their homes. Now tenants are doing this as well. In fact, GoFundMe says that their eviction-related fundraisers have surged 40% since before the pandemic, okay? So you have a ton of people doing this right now to try and collect extra money to stay in their home and not get evicted. They talked to one couple that's been behind on their rent because the husband was laid off earlier this year, and they owe about $10,000 in back rent. The landlord said they were going to file for eviction on July 1st if they didn't pay back the 10 grand in full by then. And one thing they did was start the GoFundMe, and they actually were able to raise about $8,000 so far. And the landlord said they're not going to go through with the eviction. They're going to take the 8 grand and try to help them get caught up with the rest of it in the meantime. So that's the perfect example that landlords don't really want to evict people. They want to work with them. But it's crazy that it's coming down to such desperate attempts where people need to start GoFundMes and basically beg other people for money to get caught up on the rent. Now, hopefully somebody like this will be able to continue paying once the husband gets a new job, and that's the reason they fell behind to begin with. But then you have other people that take advantage of the situation, right? Just like the tenant I had, and they find other excuses and reasons not to pay you, and those people need to be evicted. But I'm willing to bet most of them will probably end up leaving on their own because they don't want to have that eviction marked on their record. I know that's what I would do, guys. This isn't legal advice by any means, but if it were me and I was in the position of getting evicted, I would certainly leave before the court date comes in order to avoid having that eviction on your permanent record. Because once you have that, good luck finding a new place to live. It's one thing to not have the great reference from your previous landlord. It's a whole nother thing to have an eviction on your record. That's proof that you didn't pay the rent for an extended period of time and you were forced out of the property by the law. That means the sheriff came to your house, kicked down the door in some cases, and took all your stuff out and put on the curb. That's what an eviction is. And if you let it come to that as a tenant, no landlord's going to want to rent to you in the future. So I don't know, guys, there's lots of signs that things are getting worse in this economy. Evictions are on the rise past pre-pandemic levels. You have the amount of delinquencies surging right now with the banks. Like, what's going to be next? I have no idea, but I can definitely keep you posted. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.